Very few things will stir more fear into the heart of an airline pilot than an uncontrolled in-flight fire. The story that I'm about to tell you today should serve as a very good example as to why that is. Stay tuned. A huge thank you to Blinkist for sponsoring this video. The story of UPS Flight 6 really makes the hair stand up on my arms, and that's not just because I'm a commercial pilot and understand the horrors of an in-flight fire. It's also because I've been an airport firefighter, and I've dealt with fires like this, and I've been inside of a closed cabin when it's been completely filled with smoke. That's why I want you, when you watch this video, to remember and understand why it's so important that you follow the restrictions that applies to traveling with lithium batteries. Never check them in to checked-in luggage. Always keep them on your person and make sure that the batteries that you do carry are actually allowed to be carried on passenger aircraft. UPS Flight 6 started its travel in Hong Kong on the 3rd of September 2010. It's flown by a Boeing 747-400 AF aircraft. That's a dedicated freighter. And as a dedicated freighter, it has several cargo compartments. You have the lower compartments in the belly of the aircraft, and then you have the main cargo compartment, which is the majority of the body. And then up in the hump of the 747, you have the cockpit in the front, obviously, and then you have the rest area for the crew in the back of it. Now, on this day, there was a mix of different type of cargo that was loaded onto the aircraft, but in the main cargo hold in Zone 3, on positions 4, 5, and 6, there were pallets loaded which had a significant amount of batteries inside of them, mainly lithium batteries. Now, these batteries should have been declared as dangerous goods because they are, but for some reason the shipper had not done that, so the flight crew was unaware of the position of these batteries and that they were on board, and they were just loaded into their cargo positions. Now, Zone 3 and cargo positions 4 and 5 is located just below the hump of the 747, under the crew rest area, and that's going to become important very soon. The first flight of the day, which went from Hong Kong over to Dubai, was completely uneventful, except for one thing. Sometime during the cruise, the number 1 pack tripped off. Now, the pack is a machine that utilizes bleed air from the engines, and it mixes it up with cooler air from outside, and then it provides air conditioning and pressurization for the aircraft. And the 747-400 has 3 different packs. The number 1 pack provides it air, primarily to the flight deck, the cockpit, and the upper area of the aircraft, and pack number 2 and 3 provides the rest of the aircraft. So this means that 1 pack tripping off is not a big deal. The pilots just took up their quick reference handbook, they read through the checklist, and the checklist basically tells them to reduce the strain on that pack, wait for a little bit, and then push a pack reset switch. So if that works, the pack will continue to work again, and there's no further crew action needed. And this is exactly what happened. When the crew came down onto the ground in Dubai, they told their engineering department that this had happened. The engineering department had a look at it, and they couldn't reproduce the fault. But since the system was now working, they could just continue with it. The flight crew that was handling UPS Flight 6 consisted of a 48-year-old captain. Now, he was fairly experienced flying the 747-400, and he was assisted by a 38-year-old first officer. Now, this first officer had more than 5,500 hours of total time, but he only had a little more than 77 hours on the 747. So this means that he basically just started flying the type. They looked at the weather for the second flight of the day, which was going to take them from Dubai up towards Cologne Bonn in Germany. And they saw that the weather en route was good, the weather in Dubai was beautiful. So they decided that the first officer was going to be pilot flying for this second flight, which is going to become the accident flight. In the turnaround in Dubai, a couple of containers was removed from the lower cargo compartments, but the upper cargo hold, and specifically the pallets that was loaded in position 4, 5, and 6, were not touched. They were in the same position as they were in Hong Kong, and they were supposed to remain there for the flight over towards Cologne. The pilots got the aircraft ready for departure, and at time 14:41 UTC, that's 18:41 local time, they started pushing back and taxiing out for departure on runway 30 right in Dubai. The departure that they had been cleared, the runway 2 Delta, would take them straight ahead after departure, and then it would turn them left onto a westerly direction for a little while out of the southern Arabian Gulf, and then a slight right-hand turn would take them towards the northwest, towards the Bahrain FIR. And since they were taking off during the sunset and they were climbing towards a westerly direction, it meant that it was likely that they're going to be following the sunset. And when we do this, as we're climbing towards the west, sometimes you can face sunset that lasts for more than an hour. And it also means that you're going to have a lot more light inside of the cockpit. The takeoff was initially completely uneventful. The first officer hand flew the aircraft to an altitude of about 11,300 feet before he engaged the autopilot and continued to climb up to their planned cruising level of 32,000 feet to flight level 320. But as the crew climbed through about 10,000 feet, once again the pack number 1 tripped off. Now, the crew had already seen this once during the day, so the captain just took up the quick reference handbook, ran through the checklist, said, yeah, all right, so we're going to put trim air on, and then try to reset it by the pack reset switch. He did so, and once again the pack 1 came back online again. So they didn't think much more of it, and they continued to climb. But unbeknownst to the crew, down in the main cargo hold, inside one of the pallets, one of these lithium-type batteries had now suffered a thermal runaway for whatever reason. And that thermal runaway meant that a fire started to burn. And as the fire started to spread, it affected more of the battery packs. Those also suffered thermal runaways, and what you had is a chain reaction where a fire is now quickly building inside of this pallet. One thing that you have to understand though is that the 747 freighter doesn't have any thermal cameras or anything that monitors the temperature specifically in the cargo hold. What they do have are smoke detectors. But the problem with smoke detectors is of course that in order for them to go off, you need to have a sufficient amount of smoke for that to happen. So this means that this fire has likely started to burn and had been spreading inside of the pallet for several minutes before there's any type of alarm going off in the cockpit. So the pilots, they're just continuing to climb up towards their cruising altitude, happily unaware of what's going on in the back of the aircraft. Now, before we go into the very rapid accident sequence that happens in this flight, I just want to share a short message from my sponsor who makes it possible for me to produce these type of videos. I think here in the beginning of the year that we're all trying to improve ourselves. I'm trying to lose a few kilos, and while doing so, I love to find new ideas, find inspiration, or find new perspectives on things that I thought that I knew. That's why I'm so happy to have Blinkist as the sponsor of this episode, because they are a fantastic resource in doing exactly this. What they do is they have more than 5,000 titles in 27 different categories, and they take those and they distill them down to their core, which they call blinks. This means that a book that will take you hours to read through will only take you maybe 15 to 25 minutes to listen through. They do the same for podcasts, something they call shortcast, and a title that I am blinking through at the moment is The Science of Storytelling, which I'm trying to implement the lessons from in my channel. Now, if this sounds interesting to you, then go down and click on the link here below, which is blinkist.com/mentorpilot, and that will give you access to a 7-day free trial, and after that you get 25% off the premium membership in Blinkist. So go down and start getting inspired today. At time 15:12 and 54 seconds, this is about 21 minutes into the flight, a master fire warning bell goes off inside of the cockpit. This, together with the red master warning light, indicates that there's a fire somewhere in the aircraft. The captain looks down and quickly realizes that they're dealing with a fire in the main cargo deck. He turns over to the first officer and says, okay, looks like we have a fire in the main cargo deck forward part. I have control of the aircraft. This makes the first officer now pilot monitoring and the one who's going to have to deal with the non-normal checklist. And he also said, I think we should return. Now, this all happens within the space of about 8 seconds, which means that the decision to return back to Dubai comes very quickly and without any real discussion between the crew. Now, part of me understands that because a in-flight fire is among the worst things that can happen to any pilot. And especially on a cargo aircraft where the likelihood of this being a spurious warning is much lower, would definitely kind of trigger them to take a decision to try to get the aircraft down on the ground from where they were coming from. A logical decision to make. However, in this case, it's going to have some immediate consequences. Because the captain, who is now pilot flying, he also takes on the role of handling the radio. This is something that we generally do when we're dealing with an emergency, so that the pilot monitoring can focus on getting the checklist executed. The captain is now talking to Bahrain ATC, and he tells them that we have a fire indication and we need to get down quickly. Bahrain ATC comes back into them and says, okay, we understand you have Doha airport at your 10 o'clock position at about 100 miles away. Would that be close enough? And the captain said, oh, actually we would like to return back to Dubai and like to declare an emergency at this point. Dubai is about 180 miles away, while Doha is 100 miles away. But like I was saying before, it is likely that this decision to return is because the airport that they're coming from, they know that, right? They just depart from there, they know what the weather is like, they know what the runways are like, they likely have their charts, their approach charts available to them quickly. So it would just require less of a setup and less of a preparation to go back in, but it's almost twice as far away. The captain now initiates a right-hand turn to a heading of about 095 degrees. That's a reciprocal heading to what they were flying before. He also asks to and get clear to descend initially to flight level 280, 28,000 feet. He initiates the descent and then he manually disconnects the autopilot for a few seconds. He reconnects it and then a few seconds later he disconnects it again, likely just to feel how the aircraft is feeling, which is working fine at that moment. The first officer on the same time has taken up the non-normal checklist for an in-flight cargo fire and he's starting to execute that. It's important to understand here that the Boeing 747-400 doesn't have any fire extinguishing system inside of its main cargo deck. Instead, it has two things. It has a cargo fire liner which surrounds the entire cargo compartment and is made of a material that is supposed to be able to withstand very high temperatures, and that's supposed to keep any fire inside of the cargo compartment from reaching the cockpit and the crew quarters. The second part is something called a fire suppression system, which is activated through the use of the non-normal checklist. And the non-normal checklist tells the pilot that they need to either climb or descend to 25,000 feet first. And then you push the suppression button. And what that does is it deactivates pack number 2 and 3. Remember, those are the systems that are providing pressurization to the aircraft. It also opens the outflow valve, which is a valve in the back of the aircraft. Now that is going to depressurize the aircraft, so all smoke and fumes is going to be pushed toward the back of the aircraft and then out. Since the aircraft is now maintaining 25,000 feet, at that altitude the pressure is significantly lower, but also the oxygen level is lower. And the idea is that because of that, it's going to be much harder for any fire to survive or to spread. You might have noticed that pack number 1 is not deactivated by the push of this button, and there's a very good reason for that, because pack number 1, remember, is providing air and pressurization to the cockpit and the living quarters. So this means that if pack number 1 continues to do that, there will be a positive pressure differential, which means a higher pressure in the cockpit than in the cargo compartment. And the idea is that that will keep any smoke from entering into that compartment. The first officer is executing this checklist, and as part of the checklist, as a redundant feature, after you push the suppression switch, you turn off pack number 2 and 3 manually as well, just to make sure that the system is doing what it's supposed to do. Now, because the aircraft is now becoming depressurized, it's also part of the checklist to don the oxygen mask, and in this case the smoke goggles, because this aircraft does not have an entire mask covering the face. There's 2 separate units, and as the crew is putting their masks on, there is some confusion about how to be able to hear themselves, how to be able to communicate, but that's fairly quickly resolved. But as the crew is dealing with the masks, something else happens. Pack number 1 stops working once again. Now, it's not clear from the flight data recorder if pack number 1 was actually turned off in error or if once again it tripped off, but we do know that pack number 1 stopped working, and that means that it's now no pressure differential between the cargo compartment and the cockpit. Thick black smoke is now starting to billow into the cockpit. Now, you might ask yourself, I thought there was a fire liner that was supposed to stop that from happening even without the pressure differential. Well, it is likely that because this fire is situated where it is, which is on the pallet situated in cargo positions 4 and 5, which is just below the crew compartment, and the fact that it is being driven by lithium battery fires, which produce their own both energy, fuel and oxygen, that this fire is simply so hot that it burns through that fire liner and then enters into the crew rest compartment. Anyway, the crew are not aware about this. They are continuing to talk to Bahrain ATC, and the captain now asks if he can descend immediately to 10,000 feet. It's unclear why he asked for this, because remember, the quick reference handbook non-normal checklist is telling them to maintain 25,000 feet for as long as possible to try to stifle the fire. But in any case, this is being done. He is still hand flying the aircraft, and the MCP selected altitude, the mode control panel on the forward part of the cockpit, is now reset to 10,000 feet, and they initiate a descent. As he's doing this, another fire alarm goes off, this time from the main aft cargo compartment, which is logical because the smoke would have been moving toward the back of the aircraft. And there's also a smoke alarm from the crew rest area. As they're descending now, the next problem presents itself, because the captain, who is still hand flying the aircraft, starts to recognize that he doesn't have good pitch control of the aircraft. The flight data recorder indicates that he is pushing and pulling on the yoke, but that there's only minimal movement of the elevators in the back while he's doing that. He starts telling his first officer that I don't have any control of the aircraft. I have no control. And the first officer responds with, "What? What do you mean? You have no control whatsoever?" And there's a discussion going on about this. So why is this happening now? Well, the flight controls on the Boeing 747 is controlled from the yoke via cables that are connected to the pilot controls, and they then run under the cockpit floor. And then towards the back of the crew rest area, via a couple of trusses and pulleys, they are then moved up into the crown of the aircraft, and then they go through the top, the crown of the aircraft, all the way back towards the elevator, rudder, and so on. Well, it is likely that the fire, who's now burned through the cargo liner, might have damaged the truss assemblies that are moving these cables up into the crown. And if it's done that, it's going to have a severe effect on the tension of the cables. Now, the cables needs to have a specific tension for the movement of the flight controls to specifically and perfectly match what the elevators are doing. So if there's now less tension, it means that the effect that the pilots will have as they're moving the yoke is going to become much, much less. Fortunately, the autopilot is controlling the elevators, the rudders and the flight controls via electronic inputs to the activators towards the back. And that is not affected at this point, but the pilot does not know this because they're hand flying the aircraft. The smoke is now getting worse and worse inside of the cockpit, and the cockpit voice recorder transcripts indicates that the pilots are now starting to discuss that they're having problems seeing their instrumentation and seeing certain part of the cockpit. The captain asks the first officer to please set up the flight management computer, the FMC, for return back into runway 12 left. That's the opposite runway to the one they departed from in Dubai. And the first officer is saying that he can hardly see the FMC. But it is indicated on the flight data recorder that the first officer must have been able to put the approach into the FMC, because he subsequently also tuned the two nav data receivers to the ILS frequency for runway 12 left, something that is going to be needed for the approach later on. At time 15, 17 and 39 seconds, this is about 4 to 5 minutes into the emergency, the captain transmits onto Bahrain ATC and tells them that the cockpit is now absolutely full of smoke and that they're trying to turn right onto heading of 130, and tell them to please tell Dubai to have men and equipment standing by upon their arrival. The captain also asks the first officer to open the smoke shutter. Now, the smoke shutter is operated from a handle in the overhead panel, and if you open that, it effectively just opens a small tube towards a hole in the cockpit. And when you open that, under normal circumstances where there is smoke in the cockpit and the aircraft is pressurized, you're going to get a depressurization from that hole, which will then suck any smoke out of the cockpit. But in the circumstances that this aircraft is now, where they are depressurized, it is likely that this could potentially have the opposite effect, where the small Venturi effect that can be created over that hole could actually be pulling smoke into the cockpit from outside where the fire is burning. About 1 minute later, when the aircraft descends through 21,000 feet, they're now flying at maximum speed they can in order to get down as quickly as possible towards Dubai. The captain makes a brief remark about the temperature in the cockpit getting higher. Only seconds after that, he starts complaining about not getting oxygen to his mask. He says it over and over: I can't breathe, I can't get any oxygen, give me oxygen, he tells to the first officer. But the first officer doesn't know how to respond to this, and he doesn't know how to help him. There is supplementary oxygen masks available inside of the cockpit, but in order to reach them, the captain would have to go back and get them from the jump seat area. When the captain realizes that the first officer doesn't understand what he needs or where the supplementary oxygen can be found, he decides that he's going to go and get it himself. The cockpit voice recorder sounds in the general area indicates that the seat of the captain is being moved back. But in order for him to go and get this oxygen, he's going to need to remove both his smoke goggles and his oxygen mask. So he does that, he moves out of his seat. Only a few seconds later, the last words that are ever heard from the captain is, "I can't see." And then there are no more life signs from the captain throughout the rest of this flight. When the first officer receives the controls from the captain, he almost immediately engages the autopilot. And like I mentioned before, the autopilot does not suffer from the same issues with the flight control cables as the manual controls does. So the flight controls problems are now temporarily gone. But the first officer is now finding himself in a cockpit completely full with black, thick smoke, with alarms blaring around him, and with a colleague who have now disappeared to somewhere that he doesn't know or can't contact him. I cannot even fathom the amount of stress that this poor pilot would be under during these circumstances. And things are not about to get any better, because what's happening now is that as the aircraft is descending away from Bahrain, they're now getting out of radio coverage, because VHF radio is limited by line of sight. So as they're getting further away, due to the curvature of the Earth and due to them descending further towards Dubai, Bahrain cannot reach them. And Bahrain ATC has tried to get the first officer to change the radio frequency to Dubai control instead, but because of the smoke, he cannot see the radio panels, so he's unable to set the new frequency. And this is going to mean that in order for him to now get vectors, to get help to get down on the ground, he's going to have to use what we call relay from other aircraft. This means that other aircraft that is flying in the area, which are higher up or closer to Bahrain, will be able to hear the radio transmissions from the emergency aircraft. So they will have to transmit up to a relay aircraft. That relay aircraft then has to transmit down to Bahrain, and Bahrain is going to have to contact Dubai via a landline telephone in order to hear where they are, because they can't see them on their radar screen, and also for Dubai to be able to tell them what vectors to get. So then Dubai has to then tell Bahrain through the same landline what the aircraft has to do. That has to go back up to the relay aircraft and then back down again. So it's a total of 6 different movements who has to be done for each and every radio call in a situation like this. During the next 10 to 15 minutes, there's going to be about 30 different radio calls between the first officer who is flying the aircraft to the relay aircraft. And he is becoming more and more frustrated and annoyed with the fact that he's not getting any information, because at this point he cannot see his primary flight display, which indicates his speed, his altitude, his heading. He basically cannot see anything but the front part of his mode control panel. So you can imagine the feeling of not knowing where you are, not knowing where you're going, and not getting any answers from air traffic control that you're relying on in order to survive. While this is happening, the first officer is also making remarks that he's running out of oxygen. So what's happening to the oxygen system? Why did it suddenly stop working for the captain? Well, it's been very hard to determine the exact cause of this during the investigation, but it is most likely because the fire has now started to get close to the oxygen cylinders and the metal piping that runs up to the oxygen masks in the cockpit. And if that's the case, the pipings might have become so hot that they actually damaged the softer components as they went in and connected towards the masks. In any case, the oxygen supply does continue to the first officer's mask, so he is able to breathe, but just barely. The aircraft continues to descend, and at time 15:26:09 UTC, the levels off at 10,000 feet. It then continues to descend to 9,000 feet, and it's still maintaining a speed of 350 knots indicated, with flaps up, gear up, towards the extended descent line of runway 12 left. The first officer is continuously asking the relay aircraft to give him updates on his altitude, his heading, where he is, his speed, because at this point he clearly can't see anything. Now, it might be hard for you guys to understand just how bad the visibility can become when you're in a closed, smoke-filled environment. But I can tell you, as having worked as a firefighter, that it is the darkest that you can ever imagine. Even holding up your hand in front of your face, you won't be able to see it through the mask. It becomes completely pitch black, and on top of that, depending on what materials are being burned in the fire, they might also start leaving an oily, yellowish residue on everything, including your mask, which will then further decrease the visibility. The first officer continues to communicate with air traffic control through the relay aircraft. He does also try to use his secondary radio box on the emergency frequency 121.5, but as he is transmitting on that radio box, he doesn't hear any responses coming back, even though all of the other aircraft around can hear him. We don't know why that is, but there is a possibility that the volume is just turned down on his communication box too, and because he cannot see the radio tuning panel, he cannot see that that's the case either. He just thinks that no one can hear him. Eventually, he does manage to get a final vector towards runway 12 left in Dubai. He turns onto heading of 115 degrees, but he's still maintaining 9,000 feet and over 350 knots. With the kind of weight that this aircraft is at, this is a way too high energy in order to be able to land safely. At time 15:36, the aircraft flies through the 3-degree glide slope for the ILS. He, first officer, does not realize that this is happening, but very soon after that, he engages approach mode on the mode control panel. Now, if he would have done that a little bit earlier and a little bit lower speed, the aircraft would have been able to capture both the localizer and the glide slope and potentially get down and do an autoland without him being able to see. But since he's doing this after the aircraft has passed the 3-degree glide slope, it's not going to be successful. He does get information from the relaying aircraft about his distance to the runway, and he realizes that he's a little bit too high. So he resets the MCP altitude to 4,000 feet to initiate the descent. At time 15:37 and 6 seconds, he captures the false glide slope of 6 degrees. The aircraft starts pitching down, but only seconds after that, he disconnects the glide slope feature, puts vertical speed in, and he puts 2,000 feet per minute descent rate into the vertical speed. This disconnects the two autopilots that would have been able to do the autoland, but since he was on the false glide slope, it's unlikely that he would have been able to do that anyway. The localizer never captures, and that's likely because of his very high speed and altitude, just means that the localizer capture criteria for the autopilot is never being met. But he's now descending down towards the airport. He's getting closer and closer, and Dubai approach control recognizes that he is just way too high to be able to do this approach. They send the messages through the relay aircraft, and the relay aircraft asks him if he's able to do a 360. You're way too high, can you do a 360? That means making a full turn on final to lower his both speed and altitude. But the first officer comes back and just says negative, negative, and continues straight ahead. Immediately following this exchange, the first officer selects the gear down, he extends the speed brake, and he selects flaps to 20 and flaps to 30. This probably in an attempt to try to slow the aircraft down and to get it down onto the runway. Unfortunately, the cables that are activating the gear extension runs through the same trusses as the flight controls does, and they are now not available. So even though he selects the gear down, the gear is still retracted. This triggers the oral landing configuration alert, and it also shows an ACAS message about gear configuration. The first officer must have understood this, because on the CVR you can hear him saying, I got no gear. And as he's saying this, the aircraft levels off at 4,000 feet, which was the altitude that he'd selected in the MCP. As he levels off, the auto throttle changes into the speed select mode. And in the speed select mode, the auto throttle will try to protect any maximum speeds. Remember how he selected flaps 20 and then flaps 30? Well, he never got flaps 30 because of the high speed. The flaps just would not extend to that position. But flaps 20 is still selected, and flaps 20 have a maximum speed of 235 knots. Because of this, the thrust, who has up until this point been set to keep this high speed that the pilot has been asking for, is now going back to idle, and the aircraft is finally starting to slow down. While this is happening, the aircraft is overflying runway 12 left in Dubai. The first officer sets 1,500 feet in his MCP, he initiates a descent, and he also asks the relay aircraft about his position. Once the message has gone through the relay chain, the aircraft comes back and tells him that you've overshot runway 12. Are you able to make a left-hand turn, because you have Sharjah Airport at about 10 nautical miles, and Sharjah Airport has a similar runway to the Dubai runway 12. The first officer responds that, yeah, I can do that, and give me a vector quickly. And once again, he is very agitated in the way that he's speaking to the relay aircraft. The relay aircraft gives him a heading of 095 degrees to turn. That's a left-hand turn towards Sharjah. But for whatever reason, instead of setting heading 095 in the heading select window, he sets heading 195 instead. Very likely that he just cannot see exactly what he's setting. This means that instead of the aircraft making a left-hand turn, it is now making a right-hand turn instead. Now, as the aircraft initiates this turn, it does so fairly violently, possibly because of the speed and the speed brakes being partially extended. It banks over to 37 degrees bank, which is triggering a bank angle warning. This warning likely startles and disorients the first officer, because after that he adds some thrust manually. Remember, they were at idle. He just puts them up quickly, and then he disconnects the autopilot. And without autopilot, he's now left with almost no flight controls whatsoever. The auto throttle once again takes over, runs the thrust back to idle. That gives a downward momentum of the aircraft because the engines are now slowing down. So the aircraft starts pitching down to minus 14 degrees altitude, and a very rapid descent follows. If this descent angle would have been allowed to continue, the aircraft would have crashed into an area called Silicon Oasis, which is just towards the east of Dubai Airport. In this area, thousands of people are living, including a lot of the crews that are working for Emirates Airlines. The first officer is now fighting to remain in control of his aircraft, and the flight data recorder indicates full control deflections on his yoke. He actually manages to deflect the elevator slightly to get the aircraft out of that initial descent and into a slight climb, but it only lasts for a few seconds, because as the speed is now washing off the aircraft, the elevator becomes less and less effective and the descent continues. But if the first officer would not have done this, it is likely that the disaster would have been far, far greater. At time 15:40 and 28 seconds, the first GPWS warnings are starting to appear. And then they continue until the very end of the recording. At time 15:41 and 34 seconds, the Boeing 747 crashes into the ground just to the east of Silicon Oasis. It damages several empty buildings, the aircraft is completely destroyed, and the two pilots are instantly killed in the accident, but no one on the ground is hurt. This accident rocked the aviation industry, and especially the freight part of it. After the final report was completed, the emphasis became how can we come up with recommendations that make sure that something like this cannot happen again. And from that came the development of a system called EVAS, which is Emergency Visual Assurance System. It is a system that basically creates a blow-up tunnel that the pilots can put in front of their mask that makes sure that they have unobstructed view from smoke in the cockpit to their primary instrumentation outside the windshield, but also towards their charts and anything that is essential to keep the aircraft flying. There were also recommendations being made to improve the QRH checklist, the non-normal checklist, to give better guidance to the pilots as to how long they were supposed to stay at 25,000 feet before they started to descend to the closest available airport. Now I've been in contact with some friends of mine who are flying freight, and their guidance is now to keep at 25,000 feet until they're about 50 miles away from the airport, and then just dive at maximum speed down and get the aircraft on the ground and evacuate as quickly as possible. There were also a lot of recommendations that had to do with the way that a freighter aircraft was designed and the fact that there was a lack of fire, both suppression and the extinguishing system inside of the main cargo halls. Now we're also working on making sure that pallets and freight containers are better in containing fires, that there are fire recognition systems inside of the containers to give much earlier recognition of a fire to the pilots, and possibly even a way to extinguish a fire from inside of the container itself. But before we go, I also want to re-emphasize how important it is that you guys, the passengers, are aware of what kind of batteries you have in your devices, and that you never pack any of those batteries into your checked-in luggage. Also, make sure that you follow the guidance of the airlines. They will tell you what kind of batteries that you're allowed to take on board. And if you would damage a battery, if you would drop it between two seats or whatever, tell the cabin crew about it. Now, check out this video where these pilots managed to dead stick a Boeing 737 after they lose both engines in a hailstorm. If you want to support the channel, consider becoming a Patreon or buy yourself some merch. Bye bye.